So I have done research on the different phases of pilgrimages from China to different parts of China to Mecca over the past century, as you have mentioned. And although I focused pretty much on the 20th century up to the present, before the 20th century, there must have been other forms of pilgrimage travels that didn't use modern transport, such as steamships and railways and airplanes. But the issue is that there is a lack of written sources about the kinds of modes of transport that were used and the precise routes of pilgrimages from different parts of China to the Arabian Peninsula. So, for example, in the mid-18th century, there are traces of pilgrims who had come from most likely the Ottoman Empire to Guangzhou or Canton, and also traces of a famous scholar called Ma Mingxin, who was in Linxia, present-day Linxia, and we know that he performed a pilgrimage in the mid-18th century, and there must have been other pilgrims who used the overland route through Central Asia or the maritime routes through South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, but it's difficult to know what the precise routes were and the modes of transport that they used. A turning point, though, for these kinds of written records was a pilgrimage account narrated by Ma De-xin, who was based in Yunnan province, who is known to have performed the pilgrimage between 1840 and 1848. And his disciple wrote down the stops and the encounters that Ma De-xin had on his way from Yunnan to the Arabian Peninsula and back to Yunnan province through the way of Canton. So the account gives details on the stops along the oceans. So, for example, how he used the Irrawaddy River to Burma and then took ships to Calcutta and eventually reached Jeddah through the Indian Ocean, and the way back was through Guangzhou, and then he returned to the Yunnan province through the tributaries of the Pearl River. So this is just before the mass popularization of steamships, and over the decades of the late 20th century, or I'm sorry, over the decades of the late 19th century and early 20th century, there is a massive or popularization of pilgrimages to different aspiring travelers and also educators who can take advantage of the steamship transport and railways, which makes it cheaper and makes the roads more accessible to perform the pilgrimage, and it shortens the period significantly. So in the 1920s and 30s, there are publications in Chinese language that narrate the routes of the pilgrimage and in a printed form. So that I interpret it as a kind of a transition point where more people can undertake the pilgrimages, and these are for different purposes. It's for religious fulfillment of the obligation, which is the obvious reason, but also there are students who are heading to Cairo, for example, who combine the pilgrimage with their educational studies. So it's a sort of a mixed, it serves mixed purposes. And during the Second World War, there are also pilgrim diplomats who conceive of the pilgrimage as a kind of outreach to the broadly conceived Islamic world, who are sponsored by the Nationalist Party based in Nanjing and later Chongqing, who use the pilgrimage as a kind of form of diplomacy. So there are different modes and different purposes that the pilgrimage was used with the popularization of the routes through steamships and railways. And in the second half of the 20th century, or before the second half of the 20th century, in the mid 20th century, with the Chinese Civil War, these kinds of routes are also used as a means of exile for political authorities or scholars who had been affiliated with the Nationalist Party. So there are records of people who either took the ships and railways or also used older modes of transport, or, for example, crossing the mountains from the present-day Xinjiang province or Yunnan to flow through Pakistan or Bombay or Calcutta, and also from Yunnan to Burma, who used these older modes of transport plus steamships to escape from the turmoil of the Chinese Civil War, and some of whom later settled in the vicinities of Mecca. And there are also records of people like a famous warlord like Ma Bufang, who used airplanes to arrive in Jeddah and to Mecca. So these are it represents a kind of also transitional point from steamships to airplanes that mediate the pilgrimages to Mecca, and also how these routes were being used as a means of exile for certain sector of people. And in the latter half of the 20th century, there's also obviously the popularization of air transport that makes it even more accessible for Chinese Muslim pilgrims to make the trip, first from Taiwan, and after that from the PRC in the 1980s. So that was a broad overview of the different modes of transport, steamship, railways, and air, and before the modern period, most likely on foot and other kinds of sailing ships that we don't know much about yet. And then how the pilgrimages were used for multiple purposes, for performing the Hajj, but also for scholarship and diplomacy and exiles. Well, this is a very fascinating topic, the subject of guild halls or communal institutions for Chinese pilgrims that were established in Mecca. And I should put it in context that it's not only Chinese endowment institutions, but historically Mecca has hosted communal institutions, or some people call them waqf institutions, or tekke institutions that were established through donations from pilgrims and scholars and political authorities. So you'd find waqf institutions for pilgrims from Central Asia, from Southeast Asia, that are much more numerous than similar kinds of institutions for Chinese pilgrims that predate the 20th century. But for Chinese pilgrims, the earliest record we have is that one was established by a warlord who was based in Gansu. His name was Ma Fuxiang. And it was in the mid-1920s that he entrusted some of the scholars, and we assume that these scholars were part of Sufi orders who carried some of his donations, and most likely from the believers in Linsha and broader Linsha, not only the city, but in the broader Linsha region, to establish a waqf for pilgrims from China. And this also reflects as I mentioned before, the increasing popularity or accessibility of the Hajj. And so this institution was established with the purpose of accommodating the increasing number of pilgrims coming from northwest China, and also pilgrims passing through Shanghai to board the steamships. And although I say this was for Chinese pilgrims, I should also say that the definition of China in this period is also not clear. So we think that there must have also been several other institutions for the present-day Xinjiang region pilgrims. For example, Waqf for Kashgari pilgrims, or from northern parts of present-day Xinjiang. And it's possible that Chinese-speaking Muslims would have also stayed in these institutions that were more Turkestani-based Waqf institutions. But it's not easy to find records on the cross uses of Waqf institutions for pilgrims coming from different parts of Turkestan and China proper. So what's interesting about this Waqf institution that was founded in 1920s was that it goes through periods of survival and destruction and revival over the course of the 20th century. So in the 1950s, when there is a new group of exiles who settled in nearby Mecca in Ta'if, this institution was revived or gained a new momentum for as a gathering point for the new exiles who had come, who had just escaped from the Chinese Civil War. And there seems to have been a dispute between different claimants over this Waqf institution, between the Chinese pilgrims and the Indian caretakers, or most likely scholars who had been cooperating with this, who had been in charge of managing this institution. But the long story short, the group of Chinese diaspora exiles managed to make it into their ownership with the help of the son of the aforementioned warlord Ma Fuxiang, who was now in exile in California. So so I will probably not go so much into details about it, but over the 1960s and 70s and 80s, this institution actually sort of gets used by Chinese Muslim pilgrims who are coming from not mainland China, which in this period is shut down basically for in terms of interacting with the newly established state of Saudi Arabia. But the institution gets used by pilgrims coming from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and a small number from Thailand as well. So it reflects the shifting roots during the Cold War of the pilgrimage. So it was not only from the mainland China, that pilgrimages are performed, but when the ties between Saudi Arabia and mainland China were cut off, the pilgrims from Taiwan and Hong Kong and Thailand were making use of these institutions, although in small numbers. And eventually, when the Grand Mosque underwent expansion in Mecca, many of the Waqf institutions, including this one, was destroyed due to the expansion process. But interestingly, in the 2010s, the Waqf institution was revived with the activism, or sort of with the push from one of the diaspora communities in Mecca who retook the possession or the funds that had been entrusted to the community when it was destroyed, to revive this and reconstruct this waqf that I was informed was being used by new pilgrims coming from mainland China for their trade and business. So the waqf for Chinese pilgrims really shows the ups and downs of the relations between Saudi Arabia and mainland China, and also the flexibility of the religious networks that that coalesced in this institution. Well, this was a very exciting period for both the diaspora communities that I worked with in Saudi Arabia and for their relatives or acquaintances who remained in mainland China. So with the opening up, as you mentioned, we see multi-directional returns from Saudi Arabia to mainland China and from mainland China to Saudi Arabia. So in the 1980s, there's a more relaxation of religious policies and also economic reopening in mainland China. And although the relations between the official diplomatic relations between the PRC and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was established only in 1990, and before that it was Taiwan that represented the legitimate China for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Although the official relations between the PRC and Saudi Arabia started in 1990, we see pilgrimages being performed as early as from the early 1980s. So, and these pilgrims, some of them didn't have acquaintance in Saudi Arabia, but many of them actually had relatives living in the western coasts of the Arabian Peninsula or the Hijaz. So they reconnect with their family members, sometimes through the official sponsorship of the Islamic Association in China that coordinated with the World Muslim League based in Mecca. So these are two religious semi-official institutions that arrange these kinds of unofficial relations through pilgrims going from different parts of mainland China to Mecca. And this sort of reconnections opens up opportunities for diaspora communities in Saudi Arabia, which the pace picks up in the 1990s, really, when they can freely go to meet their relatives and basically the relatives that they had not known for entire life, especially for the second generation. And for the first generation of settlers in Saudi Arabia, this is also a very emotional moment of encounters with the families or siblings that they had been separated for over 30 years. So, before the 1990s, some of them go to Pakistan and to meet their families in Karachi because the movement between China and Pakistan is relatively more free. And likewise, the movement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan is relatively more free. So the middle ground is in Pakistan in the 1980s. But in the 1990s, both the first generation and second generation settlers in Saudi Arabia make use of the opening up of the PRC to reconnect with their relatives, and second, to use that opportunity to conduct small-scale business that gives them more opportunities in a way, especially. And so in my research, I looked at both the people who held citizenship in Saudi Arabia and those who didn't, which really makes a difference for the kind of social status that they have in Saudi Arabia, especially in the 80s and 90s, in terms of access to education and the right to open shops and so on. So for second generation diaspora generation or second generation groups that were born in Saudi Arabia but didn't have citizenship but had relatives in mainland China, in Gansu, Qinghai, and so on, then connections to their relatives or cousins, siblings, uncles become a sort of valuable resource to use to import small-scale things like vases or electronics and to resell it in Saudi Arabia. So this trend, I think, continued up to the present, or up to the very close moment, at least before COVID, where there were cases of tea traders and also small electronics who use for whom the entry point to China was much earlier than other traders based in the Middle East or Africa. Well, this is the big question that has been the focus of much attention in the recent years, the question of BRI. And my thinking, the geographies of BRI across Central Asia, across the Middle East, and across South China Seas and Indian Ocean, it very much overlaps with the existing religious networks, pilgrimage networks, and exile routes that I bring into attention in my research that kind of stops in the 2010s or mid 2010s, which is when the BRI is started to gain momentum. So the kinds of informal connections and networks that I examine remain both autonomous and not directly benefiting from the BRI project. That's my understanding at this point, that these kinds of small-scale trade and diaspora connections are not directly related to state-sponsored large infrastructure projects. And this, of course, the large-scale infrastructural state-sponsored projects will generate new kinds of dynamics, bringing in non-Muslim Chinese sojourners or workers in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Middle East, some of whom may convert to Islam, so that would create a new kind of wave of Islamic connections for communities in China. And also that sort of large-scale project seems to have been bringing in also Hui or other kinds of Muslim populations from China to work as translators in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. But the kinds of networks that I look at doesn't seem to be directly related to these state-sponsored infrastructure projects, and that may change in the coming years. But what's also important to point out, I think, is that the BRI can do more to engage more directly with the religious networks and really address the religious question and the Islamic question more broadly. And because these are already networks these are already the kinds of connectivities that preceded the BRI, and then it's the geographies of BRI overlap with them. But the BRI project doesn't seem to be addressing directly how it can engage these more fragmented kinds of connections, and it's more interested in building large-scale roads and ports and etc. And in China, within China, there's more research being done that Chinese Muslim entrepreneurs and translators have been utilizing new developments, such as working as translators in Guangzhou and Yiwu and so on. But this is more on the scale of individual traders forming new communities rather than participating in large-scale projects. So I want to also bring sort of mention in this respect an anthropologist, a Chinese very famous Chinese anthropologist named Fei Xiaotong, who in the 1980s proposed this vision of connectivity for the Chinese state, and it really overlaps with what's going on with the BRI, that he proposed creating networks and routes across eastern China to western China, and using Shanghai as a kind of connecting point across the South China Seas and Indian Ocean, and also developing ties between Yunnan and Southeast Asia and northwestern China to the Middle East and Islamic world. And this was in the 1980s. And he actually proposed a very explicit vision that ethnic minorities, or the populations who are classified as ethnic minorities, should be utilized or should be engaged in this kind of state-led network building. But somehow that doesn't seem to have been taken up in the 1990s, probably with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the political problems that caused. So his vision of these Eurasian connections remained and kind of survived in the form of the BRI, but his points about ethnic minorities and religious connections didn't really get taken up. So I think this is something that needs to be addressed. Regional pilgrimage sites have performed important roles throughout history. So the site in Guangzhou was one of them that I examined. But of course, there are also many Sufi shrine tomb complexes in northwestern China, and the burial site of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, or it's a supposed burial site, it's a mythical burial site, has different characteristics than the Sufi tomb complexes in places like Guangzhou, in places like Gansu and Qinghai. But I focused on this site to examine the interplay between historical narrations and the making of a place that has attracted pilgrims and travelers across China and from elsewhere, from Hong Kong and also from the Ottoman domains. So this burial site, or what is believed to be the burial site of Prophet's companion, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, is interesting for its very longevity, despite the claims, the factual claims that this site is not real, because it's known that the companion, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, wasn't buried in Guangzhou from other Islamic sources, but yet somehow the site has survived, at least from the 1700s. So for more than 300 years, there are records on inscriptions and also manuscripts that there were visitors to this site, and that there were also scholars and pilgrims who were buried in the cemetery as well while transiting, or the local community who were based in Guangzhou, the Muslim community. Some of them had also been buried in this cemetery. So I sort of explored the dynamics of between the making of this place and the role of historical imaginations, because the ideas of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas predate the 1700s, but as early as 1300s or 1400s, there were narratives about this figure who is supposed to have brought Islam to China in the very early periods, and these are kinds of mythical narrations that kind of give life to the actual place in Guangzhou. So for the past 2 decades or so, of course, the site is older than it's much older than the PRC itself. But although the site was closed down during the Cultural Revolution, what's interesting is that in the reform period and beyond, the local governments and officials and amateur historians sort of reportray this tomb of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas as an evidence of the ancient Silk Roads and so on. So there's a process of rebranding going on, and so the local state sponsors this site to be revived, and it really becomes the phenomenon becomes really prominent in the 2010s when Guangzhou hosts the Asian Games event, and then there's the sense that that Guangzhou has to be portrayed as a site that is familiar or hospitable to foreign Muslims. So there is a big expansion that goes on in 2010, and with the inflow of small-scale traders from different places in Africa and South Asia, the site is visited by both Muslim populations from across China and from Africa and the Middle East. So this site reflects the very long history of Islam in China. The site reflects the very long history of Islam in China that survives through textual narrations and building of communal institutions, and also sometimes attracting investments from the state authorities.